Started this back in December. I wanted to spend just a little bit of time recapping where we've come so far. We had some time off because we took some time off with COVID, and then the holidays have gone. Okay, so that good advice. Take in that good advice, right? So as we go through these lessons, there's lots of good advice that we're going to see. We talked about the authorship of Proverbs being Solomon in 1:1, but there's some belief the last two chapters, 30 and 31, were written by Agur and Lemuel. And we talked about the application of Proverbs by being a continual learner, right? All of us need to be continual learners. Don't ever stop learning. And then just three of the characteristics we hit on: universalism, so it applies to everyone at all times. This isn't something, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. This isn't something that just applied to the Jews back then. This is something that applies to everyone. The human nature is characterized simply throughout here. So it's there's a lot of short, I call them refrigerator back. Points. Is wisdom a being that true definition of wisdom, the fear of the Lord, and skill. Of wisdom, how wisdom is out there, but it has to be something that's accepted. You have to accept that. Landon talked. And then how we need to have that reverence for back to comes from the Bible. We have the true wisdom here, and again, we need to take that wisdom, understand that wisdom, and know that wisdom. So now is your pop quiz. We're going to go around the room, and everybody's going to say the 4 memory verses that you've been practicing since December. Okay, you ready? I'm just kidding. So I got them up here on the screen. As a real quick recap, if you grabbed an outline, they're back there. If you didn't, now's your time to embarrass yourself and go back there and grab one. But the 4 memory verses, I put them on the back, so if you want to take that with you, Tim may do something similar, and as we kind of move forward so we can remember some of these memory verses. But let's all say these together, okay? We're going to all say these together, read these aloud. So Proverbs 1:7, this is from week 1. Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Okay, so that was the first one. The second one that Jordan led us through, Proverbs 8:11. For wisdom is better than rubies, and all the things one may desire cannot be compared with her. Let's try that again so I can maybe read this time. Proverbs 8:11. For wisdom is better than rubies, and all the things one may desire cannot be compared with her. I think I have a typo in there. I apologize. And then last week, Landon's memory verse from Proverbs 2:6. For the Lord gives wisdom, come knowledge and understanding. And then tonight's memory verse, if you saw on the first slide, we're going to talk about a man and his money. So tonight's memory verse comes from Proverbs 22:2. And it says, the rich and the poor meet together. The Lord is the maker of them all. Let's say that one more time. Proverbs 22:2. The rich and the poor meet together. The Lord is the maker of them all. So hopefully you are starting to remember those. That little exercise was a little bit twofold. One, for us to help remember and go over those memory verses. The other one is, now I know that you can all talk, so when I ask questions, I need some interaction back. So I want some interaction, I want some answers, so we're going to go through here. And how I do my outlines, because I haven't ever taught here before, is I like to put questions. So the reason I like to put these questions on here is we'll go over obviously, how I would answer those questions. But hopefully I've given you enough room that you can take these lessons and go and think about them. What are your own lessons? We're going to go over a bunch of memory verses, so your fingers may get tired, memory Bible verses. So you may get tired going flipping through, but if there's others that you find or others that you know of that you can dot down there, definitely do that too. So here's first money. Okay, good. So for those of you online, either have or need money. I guess you could say that you could have a credit card, but eventually if you don't pay that off, you're not going to get any more credit cards. So everybody, there's a need for that. And one of the purposes of Proverbs overall, like Tim talked about, was helping us and obviously if you've been in the church for some time, people be rich. It's sinful to be wealthy. And in spirit. Poor in spirit, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit. The Bible talks a lot about earning money. It talks a lot about how we spend our money. It talks about saving. It talks about giving. It even warns about no different. It talks about wealth and poverty. It talks about generosity. It talks about greed. And so, it's a fact of life that there's going to be rich people and there's going to be poor people. I mean, it cracks me up when we have legislators and people in politics now that think they're going to solve all the problems. It's like, just go back and read the Bible. People have been trying to solve these things for thousands of years. I mean, what makes you special? Where some people can afford to live with all of life's luxuries, and some people are barely scraping by to get food on the table. And how do we as a church body who's made up of so many different members, so many different types of people, so many different people in different places, how do we deal with that? How do we make sure that we're following God's commands and following His rules and following the laws that He's laid out and how we're supposed to live our lives when it comes to money? Because, God's not impartial. He doesn't look favorably on one person or the other. Right? Yes or no? Yes. Okay, so what are some advantages? Security, that was the very first one I had. And I'll go ahead and throw all the ones I had up there because I messed up my animations. So security. Security was the very first one. Go ahead. Fifth cousin, 3 times removed, starts calling, hey, remember me from that family reunion? right? I mean, money brings those friends, right? The ability to speak more freely, because it gives you, going back to that first statement, it gives you a little bit more security in what you're saying. So let's read that verse 18:23 if you want to flip over there. And I'll be reading from the ESV tonight if you want to follow along, or if you have a different version. The poor use entreaties, but the rich answer roughly. All right, so there may be a time where if the money gives you this ability or this desire or this thought that you can speak more freely, right? Who's ever heard the term money's the root of all evil? Anybody ever heard that before? And they'll claim that comes from Scripture, right? Money's the root of all evil. Let's flip over to that Scripture and let's just check that. So let's read over to 1 Timothy 6, verses 9 and 10. Let's listen to what it says about money and the root of all evil. 1 Timothy 6. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. So I think I heard it already. What's the difference between what I said and what the Scripture says? Love, right?
There's two there. Exactly. Love is a root, not the root.
Right.
So it's one of other roots of evil.
Yep.
It's not the only thing that's going to lead you to evil.
Definitely not. I mean, James talks about our own evil desires, right? And your evil desire, my evil desire, they may be different. I may not have an issue with money, but somebody else may. So there's all those different types of evil desires, right? So yeah, it's that the love of money, or like he was saying, is a root of the cause, right? But it's not just money is the root of all evil. And vanity and selfishness, yet still have nothing worthwhile. Is it possible to make yourself rich through any of those ways and still have nothing worthwhile? You can shake your head on that one. You don't have to answer on that one. Yes, right. Turn over to Proverbs 13. Proverbs verse 13. Whoever gathers little by little will increase it. So think about those verses say. Verse 7, one who pretends to be rich yet has nothing. Right? You see those people that they have the nicest clothes, they have the brand new Air Jordans. Is that still a thing? That was a thing when I was a kid. I don't know. They have the new Air Jordans or whatever, right? But yet they still don't have anything. Right? All of their stuff is built up in these worldly possessions, right? And then verse 11, I mean, that's the verse that should be plastered as you land into Vegas, right? Wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it. So, I mean, think about the folks that you hear. You can hear all those stories, right? Even the professional athletes that haven't been taught how to deal with money, and all of a sudden they sign this multi-million-dollar contract, and now they're 10 years later they're completely broke. It's like you just got $30 million. How are you broke? But earned little by little will increase it, right? And then consider, Proverbs talks about an ant, right? Most of us don't like ants. I don't like getting bitten by ants. But the ants can teach us something, right? Turn over to Proverbs 6, verses 6 through 8. Proverbs 6, 6 through 8. Go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, without having any chief officer or ruler, summer, and gathers her food in harvest. Right? So, and he uses the and a couple of different times throughout Proverbs, but here he's saying, consider her ways. She doesn't have a chief officer, an officer, or ruler. Preparing herself to I told you you're going to get a hand workout flipping through all the pages tonight. Proverbs 10 verses 4 and 5 says, a slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of a diligent shame. And there, like I said, there's 5 other different sections that talk about this idea of the slack hand causes poverty, the lazy hand, and we'll talk more about laziness here in just a minute. And so as we think about that first question, the advantages of wealth, there are some advantages, but there's also some things we have to be worried about and cautious about as well. Think about the Jews. What was the kind of the common view about prosperity? If you had money, you were what? Turn over to Proverbs 14. So even Proverbs talks about the crown of the wise is their wealth. That are wealthy are the ones that God likes, and those that aren't, something. That was even equated to sin. You have to get rid of. That's not always the case. Being favorable. There's a very easy so a lot of what was going on back then. If you don't know that I'm not living right and it's perceived that God punishes the poor, then I'm going to try and right? Think about the New Testament. If a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there, sit down at my feet. Pretty clearly that we're not supposed to show favoritism based on our physical appearance or our stature in almost had to be shifted a little bit in the Old Testament. Any other thoughts, comments on question 2? So as we look at question 3, why or how do So I think it's pretty easy to the rich may oppress the poor. Right? In hand, we don't give to them. Or someone that is well off, that you can easily, oppress the poor. But if we think about how does the poor oppress the poor? You ever thought about that before? It's a little bit different context. Think about Matthew 18. So Matthew 18. Servant has 10,000 denarii and he goes up to his master, and what does the master do? He forgives him. Attention. Right? No, right? What does he do? He goes out and he finds the person that owes him 1,000. And he says, hey, I know it's been hard to pay. I was just forgiven, but it's okay. We'll work out a payment plan. No, he didn't, right? And so you think about that of a guy that was just he just owed 10,000 after he was just forgiven, right? So that you can think about, the and God's forgiveness and all of that. But I think we can learn that side lesson there of along with that forgiveness is that forgiveness of debt and that forgiveness of financial, right? And not oppressing each other and the poor. And so, whose fault is it that someone's poor? A lot of times, again, back then it was thought if there was a poor person or someone that was a beggar or someone on the side of the road, either they had something them or it was all their fault. Sometimes it can be outside circumstances. Turn over to Proverbs 30. Going back into Proverbs. Proverbs 30, verse 14. Says, there are those whose teeth are swords, whose fangs are knives, to devour the poor from off the earth, the needy from among mankind. So sometimes it's just the greed of other people that cause people to be poor. Nothing that I did, you did, whatever. It's just the greed of other people. Sometimes an extortion, a usury is a tax, basically, but it was an exorbitant tax. It was a tax that was way more than it should have been. So those are some outside ways or different ways that people can become poor. It's beyond their control, right? It's not always just the fault of the poor person. But at the same time, Proverbs and other passages clearly tell us that it can be our own fault at times. It can be our own conduct that has led us into a place like that. Turn over to Proverbs 10. We already read this one, but Proverbs 10:4. A slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. I have 6 other verses down here that talk about laziness and not working and not supporting yourself. Refusing to heed correction. Proverbs 13:18 talks about that, of not listening to correction and correcting your ways. Pleasure seeking. Proverbs 21:17. Right? If my hobby is buying Ferraris, and that's how I get my pleasure, I'm not going to be very rich for very long, like negative days. So the pleasure seeking. Proverbs 23:21 talks about drunkenness and gluttony. Right? How many times do we hear about people that, they're spending their last dimes on alcohol, on cigarettes, on drugs, on things that they're addicted to, and they don't have money to buy food. They don't have money to pay for their rent. They don't have money to pay their bills, whatever. Right? Our own choices. And then wasting time on frivolous things. Proverbs 12:11 hits on this. Again, as well as a few other verses. Proverbs 12:11. Whoever works his land will have plenty of bread, but he who follows worthless pursuits lacks sense. Whoever works his land will have plenty of bread, but he follows worthless pursuits. So basically back then, if you didn't work your land and you didn't farm and you didn't provide for yourself, you weren't eating. And it was fruitless, right? And so those are just some different ways of how we can oppress each other and how we can really think about how am I conducting my life? Am I conducting my life like God wanted me to? So as we get into question 4 and we think about that, that's the side of being poor, right? Of the poor oppressing the poor, some of the things that we can do to get ourselves there. But what are some of the dangers of worldly prosperity? And what are some of the dangers of poverty? What are some of the dangers?
One is easy come, easy go.
Okay. Yeah. We talked about that. She said, for those of you who couldn't hear, easy come, easy go, right? If you gain it quickly, it's fleeting.
You kind of focus on your prosperity and not on God. It's a distractor.
Yeah, it goes back to that love, right? That 1 Timothy, that love of money. That's my main goal, is to gain the money, right? Turn over to Proverbs 30. Proverbs 30, verses 7 through 9 says, 2 things I ask of you. Deny them not to me before I die. Remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and still and profane the name of my God. So we see it right there in verse 9, right? Lest I be full and deny you, right? I'm full, I'm wealthy, I'm what is it, fat, happy, and rich, or whatever however the saying goes, right? I don't need anything else because I'm set, right? Or the flip side is, lest I be poor and still and profane the name of God, right? So those are 2 ways that, sorry, I meant to click that up there. Those 2 ways that we can, that are dangers of prosperity and of poverty that we need to look out for. But I know we're talking a lot on money, but it's not just about money either. Proverbs deals with this idea of these dangers of wealth with not just money, but other things. Proverbs 20 and verse 23 talks about the weights. Because, back then, they didn't have these little electric scales that scaled everything correctly, and they drove these big semis on, right? Everything was done with stones, and they had these weights that would measure things out. And it'd be pretty easy for them to cheat on that, right? Either adding weight or taking away from the weight of the stone or the balance to be in their favor, right? And he talks about that in Proverbs 20 and 23. Proverbs 23, 10 through 11 talks about property. Don't go and don't go and overtake some of your neighbor's property. Because, today we have all these fancy survey tools and everybody's got plats of their land and you can go out and lay exactly where your land is and that sort of thing. Back then it was like 4 stones stacked high in the middle of the field. It's like, oh, there's my property corner, right? Nowadays my kids would be stealing people's land all over the time because they just pick up stones and move them. Like, no, you can't move that. But that's how they did it. And so people would move stones, right? They would try and take over some people's property. And that still happens today, right? For those of you that may be out on the farm or something like that, if your neighbor every time he replaces this fence, he moves it a foot over. He replaces it next year or 2 years down the road, he moves it another foot over, right? Proverbs talks about that. Proverbs deals with that, of how, we may not have all these acres of farmland like they did, but at the same time, what do we have? We got phones, we've got cars, we've got other property that we can steal or take from if we're not full, if we're not having our eye on that main prize. And if we're truly honest, a lot of this stems from this idea of greed, right? A lot of it just comes purely from greed. This insatiable desire. Proverbs 30, if you're still there, a little bit further down in verse 15, talks about these leeches. It says, this is verse 15, the leech has 2 daughters, give and give. 3 things are never satisfied, 4 never say, enough. Sheol, the barren womb, the land never satisfied with water, and the fire that never says enough. He talks about these insatiable desires, those 4 things there in verse 16. We've already talked about laziness, hypocrisy. And we look at this danger of greed and the trouble we trouble ourselves with this greed. We trouble and we make trouble for ourselves, But we not only make trouble for ourselves, we make trouble for those that are with us, and those our family. Turn back to Proverbs 15. Proverbs 15:27. Whoever is greedy for unjust gain troubles his own household, but he who hates bribes will live. So, in order to avoid bringing these troubles on ourselves, bringing these troubles on our family, others that we come in contact with, we have to get control of our greed. And for each person, that's going to be different. And it's going to be varying levels of greed. Some of you, it may be money. Some of you, it may be cars. Some of you, it may be, for me, it's bay boats. Some of you, it may be something else, right? I mean, what is that greed that you have to get control of and take control of? Any other ideas or thoughts on dangers of worldly prosperity or dangers of poverty?
Aaron,
Yes.
on verse 15:27, it says trouble for your family. And then you talked about where you can steal and profane. Many families grow up without fathers in the household because they're sitting in prison right now because they were caught stealing. And so it's a breakdown of the family unit as well. And families need fathers, they need mothers. There's a reason why God made us that way. And so it's a huge problem. It's just a snowball effect.
Right. So if you couldn't hear what Regina was saying is, the trouble for your own family is, if someone's caught stealing enough or stealing something big enough, they're going to jail, right? And if that father goes to jail, he's now leaving a single mother with maybe kids at home that's got to support themselves and causing trouble for them, which is only going to snowball into other issues of the father not being there. And I won't even get into the sermon on all the other issues that can cause, but I think we can clearly see that. Thank you. So the next question number 5 is what it should be, if you're tracking along. How may one make himself poor through generous and liberal giving and yet enjoy great riches? So how do we make ourselves generous, or how do we make ourselves poor through giving, but yet continue to enjoy great riches? Turn over to Proverbs 11. Verse 25. Whoever brings blessings will be enriched, and one who waters himself be watered. Right? Bring blessings and you'll be enriched. It's a pretty easy one. Acts 20, verse 35. Anybody know what the end of Acts 20, verse 35 says? I heard it. She gets the gold star. If I was in my 3rd grade Sunday morning class, I'd give you a star on your little binder. Right? It's more blessed to give than it is to receive. Right? Acts 20, verse 35. Winston Churchill, my grandfather told this to me so many times, it's like engraved in my head, of we make a living by what we get, and we make a life by what we give, right? It's a Winston Churchill quote. So I think that's a pretty simple concept of making ourselves, or giving ourselves great riches by the giving that we can do, by enriching the lives of other people that we come in contact with. And then, go ahead.
Paul writes in 1 Timothy, I think it's 6, he says, for those that are rich in this world, be rich in good works, ready to share and to help others. In fact,
Yep.
same concept.
So Ray said, Paul talks about in 1 Timothy how, being rich in good works, being rich in the things that God has laid out for you to do, right? Ephesians 2:10, we are God's workmanship created to do his good works, right? Turn over to Proverbs 13. 13 verse 8 says, the ransom of a man's life is his wealth, but a poor man hears no threat. I'm going to show my, I don't even know what you call it, but anybody heard the phrase, more money, more problems? I think that was a rap song when I was a kid or something. But more money, more problems. Well, the converse of that is what? Less money, less problems, right? That verse there in 13:8 says it, but a poor man hears no threats, right? We should have a conscience about money, about how we acquire it, how we spend it. Just treat money like we do a lot of things. It's a blessing from God, right? It's not ours. It's that word steward comes to mind a lot, right? We were just stewards of what God's given us, and we're supposed to be giving it. We're supposed to be putting it out there. And then think about Jesus' parables, right? one of the things that with money, money can come, or with money can come power. With wealth can come a level of power, a level of influence, or something like that, right? We need to recognize that power and be able to use it for good. The Spider-Man quote keeps coming to my head about, with great power comes great responsibility, right? Just the idea that with that power, you have to know that, right? And we won't read all these parables, but think about I just picked out 4 of the parables that Jesus talked about. We already talked about Matthew 18:23 and the servant that didn't forgive, right? Matthew 25 talks about the servant that buried his talent, right? And the one that he gave 5 and the one that he gave 2, they both doubled it, but the one he gave 1 went and buried it, right? There's that idea of being good stewards of what God's given us. Think about the Good Samaritan. We don't always think about that as a money lesson, but think about the Good Samaritan. Right? He picks this guy up that he's not supposed to be in contact with. He takes him into town. He takes him to the inn. And what does he leave him? Does anybody remember? Right. So he leaves him money. He leaves the hotel, the innkeeper, money to take care of his needs. Well, what the equivalent of what he leaves him is 2 days' wages. Right? We always read that, and I think it says I didn't write it down, but two denarii. Now, in my head, I'm like, so he left him $2 or something. No, he left him 2 days' wages to take care of this guy. That's a big commitment to give to someone, to give them 2 days' wages to take care of this guy that he wasn't even supposed to be with. And then you think about Luke 12. That's the parable of the rich fool who stored up his wealth, but he was never able to use it, right? Jesus talks about, consider this rich fool who had a very plentiful harvest and said, what am I going to do with all this? I don't have a place to store it. And so he tore down his barns to build bigger ones. I don't know why he tore down his barns in the first place, just build another one. But he tore down his barns to build bigger ones to store all of his wealth, right? And Jesus says, but then the next day he was called up. Right, so what good is that? What good is it to store and to keep all that? We're supposed to be generous with the things that we're given. And then lastly on this idea is Proverbs 21. So turn over to Proverbs 21 real quick. Proverbs 21:21. I'll read through 23. And I want you to think about as I read through here, what is necessary on our part before God will ever hear our cries of need? And hint, answers on the board. Proverbs 21:21. Whoever pursues righteousness and kindness will find life, righteousness, and honor. A wise man scales the city of the might and brings down the stronghold in which they trust. Whoever keeps his mouth and his tongue keeps himself out of trouble. So what's necessary before God will hear our cries? Pursue righteousness and pursue kindness, right? Verse 21, pursue righteousness and kindness. Verse 23, whoever keeps his mouth and his tongue keeps himself out of trouble. Right? So just that idea of being able to pursue righteousness, pursue kindness. Right? So righteousness, being right with God, following his commands. Kindness, the command of God to love our neighbor as ourselves. Right? Pursuing those will make us rich. Will make us rich in our good works. Will make us rich in the things that God's had us prepared for us to do. Any other questions or comments on that before we move on? Next question. Yes, sir.
Define rich.
So that's a good question. And if you didn't hear his question, he said define rich. So
Humility and fear of the Lord.
Humility and fear of the Lord.
Proverbs 22:4.
So Proverbs 22:4, the reward for humility and fear of the Lord is riches and honor and life. Right?
View it in the world content. So I can't go out here in the holy clothes and say I'm rich because I believe in the Lord is holy. We have two factors to deal with there. We have religion and we got the world.
Right. You got the religion.
The world that makes a determination who's rich, who's poor.
Right. Yeah. So what he's saying is there the contrast between the world's view of the rich and the Christian or the religious view of being rich. Right. Just like a lot of things. Right. The world has a view of love. We have a view of love, right? And we have to understand those concepts of where that's coming from. So that was the bell, and I've only got about 45 minutes of material. No, I'm just kidding. Question 6. Is it better to be rich, poor, or merely content in whatever state we find ourselves? So 3 John 1 and verse 2 is a passage that is used by our very own Joel Osteen is here, and some other the health, wealth, and prosperity people that you'll hear talk of. It says, "Beloved, I pray that all may go well with you and that you may be in good health as it goes well with your soul," right? It's used as kind of the proof text that God wants us to always be healthy, wants us to always be prosperous and all that. Well, the proper interpretation of that is that it's really just a greeting, right? We always wish for our friends to be well, right? You don't go up to your friends and say, "Hey, hope you have a horrible day. Good luck. Nice to see you," right? We want them to do well. It's a greeting there. It's a long stick to take to equate that to saying God wants us to be wealthy physically in the worldly sense and healthy, right? And so as we think about what's wrong with that, when we think about Jesus' teaching in the interpretation of that verse, Matthew 6 and Matthew 6, 19 and 21, and that first bullet's supposed to be 24, not 25, but we're going to read them all anyways. So Matthew 6, 19 talks about, we won't read the whole thing, but it's talking about laying your treasures up, right? Don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy. And we've already talked about that a little bit. Verse 22, the eye is a lamp of the body. So your eye is healthy, your whole body will be healthy. Verse 24, no one can serve 2 masters, for you will hate the one and love the other. He'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money, right? Don't worry about what is going to be provided. And that's what 25 through 34 talks about, right? Not being anxious. Don't be anxious. The flowers and the birds, they're all taken care of. Why are you anxious about how you're going to be taken care of? And then another good example of why we should be content. So I guess I never really answered the question from my point of view, but we should be content with where we're at a given time. And I think we'll fluctuate between those two. I sure did. When I think all the newlyweds can say, at one time we would not consider ourselves in the worldly perspective rich, right? But can we be content with where we're at? And you think about the apostles' teaching. I got 2 verses right up there, 1 Timothy and Philippians, where Paul talks about having food and clothing. I think this is the verse that you were talking about earlier, Ray, in 1 Timothy 6, verses 8. But if we have food and clothing, with these things we will be content, right? And that whole section there about being content with where he's at, right? And then the other verse in Philippians talking about whatever situation we're in, be content in that situation. That doesn't mean that we don't continue to work, right? We talked about that earlier. Laziness is still not where we need to be. That doesn't mean that we're content to be just sit back and not work and not prepare for ourselves, not prepare ourselves, not give to people and do all of that. That's not a license to be lazy, but it's a license to not be greedy. It's a license to not try and reach out and not try and a license to want to be able to give to other people. And the last question I have on your paper there is how may we overcome the love of money? I'll throw them up there real quick just for the sake of time, but three main points. One, working to provide for ourselves. Proverbs 27:18 talks about that, about working to provide for ourselves. And we just talked about the apostles, right? So first, you need to work to provide for ourselves. Second, taking due care to preserve and increase our property. This doesn't have quite the same context, like I mentioned earlier, to us at least, or at least to me, because I don't live on a farm right now. But back then, if you didn't take care of your farm, if you didn't take care of your land, if you didn't take care of the things that God had given you, you didn't eat. You weren't provided for, right? And so taking care of the things that we have, taking care of the cars that we have, right? Do I need to get that brand new car? Or can I take care of the car that I have, right? And continue to use it. And then like we've talked about, using wealth as a steward for God. So continuing to use our wealth. In Proverbs 3 verse 9 and 28:27, if you want to jot those down. Actually, I know the bell just rang, but let's read that real quick. Proverbs 3 verse 9, because they're basically the same. It says, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. That's Proverbs 3 verse 9. And then Proverbs 28:27 says, whoever gives to the poor will not want, but he who hides his eyes will get many a curse. So think about those two verses and how similar they sound to Jesus' answer to which is the greatest command. Give to the Lord your first fruits and give to your other people. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. Right? Those two line up really well. So as we think about and wrap up today, think about those 3 points. How do we overcome this love of money or this greed? Provide for what you need, not want, need. Take care of what you have and be good stewards of that towards God's works that He's set out for you to do. Any closing questions, comments? Thank you for your interaction. Thank you for your time and appreciate it. And be aware with us if you're live streaming. We'll transition to our Devo in just a minute.